struggling cowboy saw his barn burn. Until the arsonist asked him for shelter, Sam Creek watched 20 years of dreams turn to ash in a single night. But what he didn't see was the shadow on the ridge, the man who lit the match that would change both their lives forever. The first thing Sam Creek noticed wasn't the smoke. It was the silence. The cattle should have been lowing in the distance, restless in their pen as evening settled over the valley. The chickens should have been clucking in their coop, settling in for the night. Even Old Blue, his father's dog who'd lived longer than any dog had a right to, should have been barking at something. A coyote, a shadow, the wind itself. But there was nothing. Just silence, so thick it pressed against his eardrums like cotton. Sam stood in the doorway of his cabin, coffee mug cooling in his weathered hands, and felt the wrongness of it settle in his bones. 3 years of drought had taught him to read the signs. The way dust moved across his land like ghosts looking for water. The way the cottonwood by Maria's grave had stopped trying to leaf out come spring. The way silence could mean death was coming. He'd sold the last of the cattle 2 weeks ago. 12 head of scrubby longhorns that barely brought enough to cover half what he owed the bank. The chickens had gone the week before that, to Mrs. Henderson in town who paid in silver coins that felt cold as winter in his palm. Blue had been buried under the cottonwood next to Maria last spring, when the old dog finally gave up waiting for Sam's father to come home from a war that had ended 20 years ago. So the silence made sense. What didn't make sense was the way the air tasted, sharp and wrong, like lightning before a storm that wouldn't come. Sam set his coffee on the porch rail and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on earth, so dry it sounded like breaking bones. The October wind picked up, carrying something that made him stop cold in the middle of his yard. Smoke. Not the clean smoke of a chimney or a cooking fire, but the thick, hungry smoke of something that wasn't meant to burn. Sam's eyes went to the barn, and what he saw there made his heart forget how to beat. Orange light danced against the weathered boards like the devil's own fiddle music. Flames crawled up the sides of the building that had stood since his father's time, eating 20 years of hay, 20 years of tools, 20 years of hope that someday things might get better. Sam ran. His boots slapped against the hard ground, each step echoing like gunshots in the empty valley. The heat hit him before he was halfway there, washing over him in waves that made his eyes water and his lungs burn. But he kept running, because inside that barn was everything he had left in the world. The old plow his grandfather had brought from Missouri. The bridle Maria had braided from horsehair the summer before she died. The wooden box where he kept the letters his father had sent from the war, letters that smelled like gunpowder and longing and promises that would never be kept. By the time he reached the barn, the roof was already gone. Flames reached toward the stars like desperate prayers, and the heat pushed him back with hands that felt solid as stone. Sam stood there watching his life burn, feeling smaller than he had since he was 12 years old, and his mother told him his father wasn't coming home for Christmas or any other day. The fire roared like a living thing, drowning out the sound of his own breathing, his own heartbeat, his own whispered curses at a god who seemed to take pleasure in grinding him down to dust. Sparks danced in the air like fireflies made of destruction, landing on his clothes, his hair, his outstretched hands, as if they wanted to take him too. He should have run for water, should have tried to save something, anything. But Sam Creek stood there in the orange light and let 20 years of struggle wash over him like the heat from those flames. 20 years of crops that failed, of cattle that died, of bills that came like clockwork while the money never did. 20 years of talking to Maria's grave, because there was no one left who remembered his voice. The barn cracked and groaned, and then the walls came down all at once, folding in on themselves like a house of cards in a strong wind. Flames shot higher, reaching for the sky with fingers made of everything Sam had ever owned, ever loved, ever hoped to pass down to children he'd never had. When the fire finally started to die, when there was nothing left to burn but memory and regret, Sam noticed something else. Fresh horse tracks in the dust, leading to the ridge. Leading away. Someone had been here. Someone had watched. Sam looked up at the dark outline of the ridge against the star-scattered sky. But whoever had been there was gone now, swallowed by the night, like a secret too terrible to speak out loud. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of ash and loss across his land, and for the first time since Maria died, Sam Creek felt tears on his cheeks. He stood there until dawn, watching his past turn to embers, never knowing that the man who had lit the match was watching him too, watching and waiting and carrying a burden heavier than all of Sam's losses combined. The morning sun would bring more than just light to Sam's burned world. It would bring a stranger with hollow eyes and hands that shook with secrets, asking for something Sam thought he had nothing left to give. 3 days after his barn burned to ash, Sam Creek heard a knock on his door and found the one person who could destroy what little he had left, or maybe save it. The rain came on the third day, like God finally remembered Sam Creek existed and decided to mock him with water he no longer needed. Sam sat on his porch, watching October's tears turn the ash of his barn into gray mud that looked like the dreams he used to have. The coffee in his cup had gone cold hours ago, but he held on to it anyway because letting go felt too much like giving up, and he wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The drops fell steady and soft, the kind of rain that would have saved his crops if it had come in July instead of now. It drummed against the tin roof of his cabin with a sound like small fingers tapping, patient and persistent, asking to be let in. But there was nothing left to save. The insurance man had been clear about that. No money for a man 3 months behind on his premiums. No help for someone the world had already written off. Sam closed his eyes and listened to the rain wash away what remained of 20 years. In the distance, thunder rolled across the valley like wagon wheels on a road that led nowhere he wanted to go. That's when he heard it. 3 knocks, soft as the rain, but somehow louder than the thunder. Sam's eyes opened. Nobody came out here anymore. The preacher had stopped trying after Maria died, when Sam made it clear that God and he weren't on speaking terms. The neighbors, what few were left, had their own troubles to worry about. And the bank wouldn't send anyone in weather like this, not when they could wait for sunshine to deliver bad news. The knocks came again. 3 times, careful and polite, like whoever was on the other side knew they were asking for more than they deserved. Sam set his coffee cup on the porch rail and walked to the door, his boots echoing in the empty cabin. Through the small window, he could see a shape on his porch, tall and thin, bent against the rain like a tree that had learned to bow before the wind broke it. He opened the door. The young man standing there looked like he'd been carved out of hunger and held together with regret. His clothes hung off him like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd had enough to eat and a place to sleep that wasn't the hard ground. His hat was pulled low, but not low enough to hide eyes that looked older than his face. Eyes that had seen things a boy his age shouldn't have to carry. "Sir," the stranger said, and his voice cracked like he hadn't used it in days. "I'm sorry to bother you. I was hoping you might have some work, or maybe just a place to get out of the rain." Sam looked him over. The boy couldn't be more than 20, with hands that shook when he thought no one was looking and boots that were more whole than leather. There was something desperate about the way he stood, like he was ready to run if Sam so much as frowned at him. "Don't have any work," Sam said, and watched the boy's shoulders sag. "Don't have any money to pay for it, even if I did." "I don't need money," the stranger said quickly. Just a meal, maybe, and somewhere dry. I can work for that. I'm good with my hands. I can fix things, build things. I'm not afraid of hard work." Sam almost smiled at that. Hard work. As if hard work had ever been enough to keep a man's world from falling apart. As if 20 years of sweat and blood and stubborn hope meant anything when the rain came too late and the bills came too early. "What's your name, boy?" "Jesse," the stranger said. "Jesse, just Jesse. No last name." That meant he was running from something or someone. Sam had seen enough drifters to know the signs. But there was something else in the boy's face, something that made Sam think of himself at that age, lost and looking for a place to belong, even if that place was just a dry corner and a bowl of beans. "Well, Jesse, just Jesse," Sam said, stepping back from the door. "I suppose you can come in out of the rain, but I'm not promising anything beyond that." The relief that washed over Jesse's face was so raw it hurt to look at. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I won't be any trouble, I promise. You won't even know I'm here." But Sam already knew that wasn't true. As Jesse stepped into his cabin, shaking rain from his coat like a dog that had finally found shelter, Sam felt something shift in the empty space where his life used to be. It wasn't hope. He wasn't fool enough to call it that. But it was something, a presence that filled the silence, even if just for a while. "There's coffee on the stove," Sam said. "And beans. Not much else, I'm afraid." "That's more than I had an hour ago," Jesse said, and the gratitude in his voice made Sam's chest tight. As Jesse warmed his hands over the stove, Sam watched him from the corner of his eye. The boy moved careful as a cat, like he expected to be thrown out any second. His clothes steamed in the warmth of the cabin, and Sam caught the smell of wood smoke clinging to the fabric. Not the clean smoke of a campfire, but something darker. Something that reminded him of the night his barn burned. "Where you from, Jesse?" Sam asked. The boy's hands stilled over the coffee pot. "Here and there," he said, not turning around. "Been traveling for a while now." "Traveling from what?" Jesse poured coffee into a cup with hands that shook just enough to make the liquid slosh. "From mistakes, mostly." Sam nodded. He understood mistakes. They were about the only thing he had left in abundance. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the ash of Sam's old life into the thirsty ground. Inside, two broken men sat at a table that had once held family dinners, sharing coffee and the kind of silence that said more than words ever could. Neither of them spoke about the smell of smoke that clung to Jesse's clothes, or the way his eyes kept darting to the door like he was measuring the distance to escape. Neither of them mentioned the fresh horse tracks Sam had seen by the burn barn, or the way guilt sat on Jesse's shoulders like a coat that didn't quite fit. Some truths Sam had learned took time to surface. Like seeds planted too deep, they had to work their way up through layers of fear and shame before they could see the light. As the rain drummed against the windows and two strangers became something like companions, neither man knew that the hardest conversations and the most surprising grace were still waiting in the days ahead. The boy who burned Sam's barn asked to stay and help rebuild it, and somehow, hammering nails into what became hammering hope back into two broken hearts. The hammering started before dawn. Sam woke to the sound of metal striking wood, steady and sure, echoing across his land like a heartbeat that refused to quit. For a moment, lying in the bed he'd shared with Maria, he thought he was dreaming. Nobody built anything on his land anymore. Nothing grew here, nothing lasted, nothing stayed. But the sound kept coming, and Sam pulled on his boots and walked outside to find Jesse kneeling in the mud where the barn used to stand, sorting through charred timbers like he was panning for gold. "What are you doing, boy?" Jesse looked up, his face streaked with ash and determination. "Some of these beams are still good," he said, holding up a piece of wood that was black on one side, but solid underneath. "The fire didn't get all the way through. We could use them." "Use them for what?" "To build it back." Sam stared at him. In the pale morning light, Jesse looked like something out of the Bible, covered in soot and working with his hands to make something new from something destroyed. But Sam had learned long ago that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Boy, I don't have money for lumber. Don't have money for nails. Don't even have money for the coffee we've been drinking." Jesse stood up, wiping his hands on his already dirty pants. "There's a sawmill about 10 miles south that's been shut down for 2 years. Owner moved to California, left everything behind. I passed it on my way here. There's enough good lumber there to build 2 barns, just sitting there getting weathered." "That's stealing. That's salvage," Jesse said quietly. "Taking something that's going to rot anyway and making it useful. I don't think God minds when a man tries to build something instead of watching it fall down." Sam looked at the pile of blackened wood, then at Jesse's face, dirt-streaked and hopeful in a way that made Sam's chest ache. The boy couldn't be more than 20, but his hands were already scarred from work, and there was something in his eyes that said he'd spent too many nights sleeping on the ground, too many days going hungry. "Why?" Sam asked. "Why would you want to help me build anything? You don't owe me nothing." Jesse was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the valley where the morning mist was burning off the distant hills. When he spoke, his voice was so soft Sam almost missed it. "Maybe I owe somebody something," he said. "Maybe this is how I pay it back." So they built. For 3 weeks, while October turned into November and the first frost painted the grass silver, they worked side by side in the ruins of Sam's old life. Jesse had been right about the sawmill. It was full of good lumber, seasoned and ready, just waiting for someone to give it purpose. They loaded Sam's wagon until the springs groaned, making trip after trip until they had enough wood to frame a building twice the size of what had burned. Jesse worked like a man possessed, like building this barn could somehow rebuild something inside himself that had been broken. His hands, which had shaken that first day, grew steady with purpose. He measured twice and cut once, the way Sam's father had taught Sam 40 years ago. He fitted joints so tight they didn't need nails, though they used them anyway because some things were worth doing right even when nobody would notice. Sam watched the boy work and remembered what it felt like to believe in tomorrow. There was something about the rhythm of building, hammer striking nail, saw biting wood, the satisfying thud of a beam settling into place, that made the future seem possible again. Not easy, but possible. In the evenings, they sat on Sam's porch and shared meals that stretched further than they should have. Beans and bacon when they had it, beans and hope when they didn't. Jesse proved surprisingly good at making something out of nothing. He could turn a handful of wild onions and some flour into something that tasted like it came from a real kitchen, with a real family sitting around a real table. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" Sam asked one night, watching Jesse stir a pot that smelled like heaven and probably tasted better. "My ma," Jesse said, not looking up from the fire. Before she died, she used to say that hungry people can't choose their food, but they can choose how they think about it. She'd make these big stories about where our supper came from, like maybe the beans were grown by a farmer who sang to his crops, or the bacon came from a pig who lived such a good life he was happy to feed folks. That's a pretty way to think about things. Jesse shrugged. Made the hunger easier, anyway. They talked more as the barn took shape. Jesse told stories about the places he'd been, the people he'd met on the road. He never mentioned family except for his mother, never talked about why he'd left wherever he'd come from. But sometimes, in the quiet moments when they were both focused on their work, Sam caught him staring at nothing with eyes that looked haunted. "You running from the law?" Sam asked one afternoon, when they were raising the roof beams and Jesse's hand started shaking again. "No," Jesse said, and Sam believed him. "Running from myself? Mostly." Sam understood that. He'd been running from himself for 3 years, ever since Maria died and left him alone with a land that didn't want him and debts he couldn't pay. The only difference was that Sam had been running in place while Jesse had been running down roads that led nowhere. "Sometimes a man's got to stop running," Sam said, holding a beam steady while Jesse nailed it in place. "Got to turn around and face whatever's chasing him." Jesse's hammer missed the nail and nearly caught his thumb. What if what's chasing him is worse than what's ahead? Then maybe he needs to find somebody to help him face it. By the time November's first snow dusted the valley, the barn was nearly finished. It was bigger than the old one, stronger, with a loft for hay and stalls for animals Sam didn't have yet, but maybe someday would. Standing in the doorway at sunset, with the last light painting the new wood golden, Sam felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Pride, not in what he'd accomplished alone, but in what they'd built together. The barn stood solid and square, ready for whatever storms might come. It wasn't just a building, it was proof that broken things could be made whole again, that endings could become beginnings if a man was willing to pick up a hammer and start swinging. "It's beautiful," Jesse said, standing beside him. There was wonder in his voice, like he couldn't quite believe they'd actually done it. "It's something," Sam agreed. Then, because he'd learned that some things needed to be said out loud, he added, "Couldn't have done it without you, boy. Wouldn't have even tried." Jesse was quiet for so long that Sam thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with something that might have been tears. "I never built nothing before that wasn't meant to hurt somebody," he said. "Never made something that would last." Sam looked at him, really looked, and saw past the dirt and exhaustion to something deeper. The boy's guilt sat on him like a physical weight, bending his shoulders and dimming his eyes. Whatever he'd done, wherever he'd come from, it was eating him alive from the inside. "Well," Sam said quietly, "now you have." As winter settled over the valley and their work neared completion, both men carried secrets that grew heavier with each passing day, secrets that would soon demand the same honesty they'd put into every nail and board of their shared creation. When Jesse finally whispered the words, "I burned your barn," Sam Creek had to choose between justice and mercy, and his decision would change everything either of them thought they knew about forgiveness. The snow fell like confession, soft, quiet, and impossible to take back once it started. Sam stood at his kitchen window, watching the first real storm of winter settle over the valley. The new barn looked strong and proud under its white blanket, ready for whatever the season might bring. In 2 days, they'd hang the last oar and call the work finished. In 2 days, Jesse would probably move on down the road, the way drifters always did when the job was done and the weather turned hard. The thought sat heavy in Sam's chest, heavier than he wanted to admit. Somewhere over the past month, the boy had become more than just a pair of willing hands. He'd become something like family, filling the silence with stories and laughter and the kind of easy companionship Sam hadn't known he missed. Behind him, coffee bubbled on the stove, and he could hear Jesse stirring in the small room off the kitchen where he'd been sleeping. The boy had nightmares sometimes. Sam could hear him through the thin walls, muttering apologies to people who weren't there. But in the morning, Jesse always woke ready to work, ready to build something good from the ashes of whatever haunted his sleep. "Morning, Mr. Creek." Sam turned to find Jesse standing in the doorway, already dressed, but looking like he hadn't slept much. There was something different about him today, something restless and desperate, like a man who'd made up his mind about something terrible. "Coffee's ready," Sam said. "Figure we might take the day off from the barn. Weather's not fit for finishing work." Jesse nodded, but didn't move to pour himself a cup. He just stood there, looking out the window at the falling snow like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Mr. Creek," he said finally, his voice so quiet Sam had a strain to hear it. "I need to tell you something." Sam's hands stilled on his coffee cup. He'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it, sensing it building like storm clouds on the horizon. Whatever Jesse was carrying, it was too heavy to hold much longer. "All right," Sam said. "I'm listening." Jesse walked to the window and pressed his palms against the glass, leaving prints in the condensation like evidence of his presence. When he spoke, his words came out in a rush, like he was afraid if he stopped, he'd lose the courage to continue. "I've been lying to you," he said. "Not about my name or where I'm from, but about why I came here. About what I did." Sam set his coffee down carefully, his heart starting to beat faster. "What did you do, Jesse?" The boy's shoulders shook, and for a moment Sam thought he might break down completely. But then Jesse straightened, turned around, and looked Sam in the eye for the first time in days. "I burned your barn, Mr. Creek." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, thick and choking and impossible to ignore. Sam's coffee cup trembled in his hands, the hot liquid sloshing against the rim. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, covering everything in white. "I burned your barn," Jesse said again, quieter this time. "It was me. I was hungry and cold, and I thought maybe if I made it look like an accident, you might collect insurance money and move away, and I could squat in your cabin for the winter. I didn't know you, didn't think about what it would mean to you. I was desperate, and I made a terrible choice." Sam stared at him, trying to make sense of the words. The boy who'd worked beside him for weeks, who'd shared his food and his stories and helped him build something beautiful from nothing. This same boy had struck the match that destroyed his life. "You watched me," Sam said slowly. "That night. You watched me stand there and lose everything I'd left." Jesse's face crumpled. "Yes, sir. I watched from the ridge, and I saw what it did to you. How you just stood there while it all burned. And I knew then that I'd done something I could never take back, never make right. Then why didn't you leave? Why did you come to my door?" "Because running wasn't working," Jesse whispered. "I've been running for 2 years, from one bad choice to another, and every mile just made me feel smaller and meaner and more lost. When I saw what I'd done to you, saw the way you looked standing there in the firelight, I couldn't run anymore. I had to try to fix it, even if I didn't know how. Sam walked to the stove and poured himself fresh coffee with hands that barely shook. His mind felt strangely clear, like the snow had settled not just on the land but on his thoughts, making everything quiet and simple. So you decided to help me rebuild. I decided to try to give back what I took. I know it's not enough. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything. But I had to try. Sam looked at Jesse, really looked at him. The boy's face was streaked with tears he wasn't bothering to wipe away, and his hands hung at his sides like he'd forgotten what to do with them. He looked young and lost, and so full of shame it radiated from him like heat from fire. How old are you, Jesse? 19, sir. 19. Sam had been 19 when he married Maria, thought he knew everything about right and wrong, about how the world worked. 19 and full of certainty that had crumbled with the first real test. You got any family? No, sir. Been on my own since I was 15. 15. Sam shook his head. A boy, really? A scared, hungry boy who'd made a terrible choice and then spent a month trying to unmake it with sweat and lumber and the kind of honest work that most men twice his age couldn't manage. Jesse was backing toward the door now, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. I'll go, he said. I'll leave right now, and you'll never see me again. I had to tell you. I couldn't finish the barn and not tell you. Where will you go? I don't know. Somewhere. Away. In this storm. Jesse's laugh was bitter as winter wind. I've walked through worse. Done worse things in better weather. Sam stood there in his kitchen, looking at the boy who'd burned his barn and then spent a month rebuilding it better than it had ever been. Outside, the snow fell thick as forgiveness, and somewhere in the quiet space between heartbeats, Sam made a choice that surprised them both. Pour yourself some coffee, he said. Jesse stopped moving toward the door. Sir, come repeated. Pour yourself a cup and sit down. We need to talk about finishing that barn. I don't understand. Sam sat down at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten breakfast with Maria for 15 years, where he'd signed the papers to sell his cattle, where he'd counted out coins to pay bills that never seemed to get smaller. Now he was using it to serve coffee to the boy who'd burned his barn, and somehow that felt right. I've been thinking about forgiveness lately, Sam said. Maria used to say it wasn't something you did for other people. It was something you did for yourself, to keep the poison from eating you alive. I never understood what she meant until now. Jesse sat down across from him, moving like he expected the chair to disappear. You should hate me. Probably should, Sam agreed. But here's the thing. Hating you won't bring back my old barn. Won't change what happened. And it sure won't make me feel any better about lying awake at night, listening to the wind blow through the empty spaces in my life. He sipped his coffee, watching Jesse over the rim. But building something new with you, that's given me more peace than I've had in 3 years. That's worth something. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Probably not, Sam said. But maybe that's what makes it forgiveness instead of just good business. They sat in silence while the snow fell and the coffee grew cold. Finally, Jesse spoke, his voice raw as scraped wood. What happens now? Sam looked out at the barn they'd built together, solid and true under its blanket of white. He thought about the boy who'd struck the match and the man who'd picked up the hammer. He thought about Maria, who believed that broken things could be made beautiful again if someone was willing to do the work. Now we finish what we started, he said. We hang that door, and then we figure out what comes next. Together. Jesse's tears came freely then, and Sam let him cry. Outside, the storm raged and the world turned white, but inside the cabin, 2 men sat at a table and learned that sometimes the heaviest burdens became the strongest foundations if you were brave enough to build on them instead of being buried beneath them. When spring came, they would plant crops in the fields around the new barn. They would buy cattle with money Jesse earned working at the neighboring ranches, money he insisted on contributing to the man whose life he'd tried to steal. They would work side by side through summers and winters, through drought and plenty, building something that would last longer than either of their mistakes. But all of that was still to come. For now, there was just coffee growing cold, snow falling soft as grace, and the quiet miracle of two broken men choosing to build something beautiful from the ashes of what they'd lost. In the end, Sam Creek learned that some fires burn away everything you thought you needed, leaving only what you cannot live without: the courage to begin again, and someone willing to help you hold the hammer.